Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this ongoing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to this Tuesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I am Bill O'Brien, and it is a pleasure to be with you on this Tuesday. It is the 9th day of September in the year 2014, and again, we're beginning our regular Tuesday program late. As you know, we run on the half hour on Tuesdays, and so we'll only have a 90-minute program today rather than the 120-minute program we had yesterday, and I hope with God willing, we'll have again tomorrow. So it is a pleasure to be with you. I thank you for your willingness to give us a portion of your time. In this day and age, everybody realizes that time is just about the most precious thing that we have. And the fact that you're willing to give up a little of it to tune in to the Virtual Center and to the Head On Radio Network, I want you to know is very, very appreciated. We do invite you to participate even more actively by giving us a call if you are so inclined. Our phone number is area code 304-574-8178. That's 304-574-8178. If you'd like to email me directly, my email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. Before we get into today's program, just a couple of minor comments that I think might be of interest. One was that I received an email yesterday from a listener, and this particular emailer wanted to email me with something, but was reluctant to use the email address that I was giving, which is a Gmail account, a Gmail address. And given the kinds of things that are going on in today's world, I think I got that message. And I thought it was interesting because it's the first time that anybody has said, I've got something I want to say, things I want to say, but I don't want to say them at that particular email account, and wanted to know if I had an alternative one. And I did send one, but it's very, very interesting. That was very, very interesting. It got me thinking when I got that comment last evening. And one additional thing I mentioned some weeks ago. Excuse me for the cold. I feel fine, but I have this nagging wheezing and coughing, this respiratory issue that causes me to take fits of coughing, and I apologize. I'll do the best I can to use the pause button in order to minimize the irritation that listening to somebody that has a nagging cough is like. I'll try to not put you through that any more than I need to. But at the beginning of the program, I want to let you know that I understand and I appreciate how irritating it is, and I apologize. I'll do the best I can. I've got hot coffee here, which is in part a way, I hope, to minimize the need to take coughing breaks, as it were. But one of the things I wanted to mention was that the reason we start a half hour late on Tuesdays is because I have a Rotary meeting, a local Rotary meeting that begins here at noon, and it runs until 1. And so it takes me about 15-20 minutes to get home. And so I just kind of get here just before we go on the air at 1:30. And since there is another program on the Head On Radio Network when we finish at 3, it wasn't possible to move this program up a half an hour. So we had really no choice but to trim it by a half an hour on Tuesdays. But I was sharing with Bob Kincaid before we went on the air that the program today was so interesting because it was delivered, the Rotary program, that is, was delivered by the new basketball coach at Marshall University in Huntington, West Virginia. His name is Dan D'Antoni, And he's the brother of Mike D'Antoni, who up until last year, as you may recall, was the coach of the LA Lakers, and before that was the coach of the New York Knicks. And Dan is his older brother, a couple of years older. And Dan coached high school basketball for some 30 years in South Carolina after a couple of years of coaching at Marshall right after he graduated. And then went to join his brother, then did some coaching with the Knicks, and then went to join his brother when his brother moved from the Knicks to the Los Angeles Lakers. And he was out there for a couple of years. And it's only, I think last year was his first year back here in his home. He's from this area, coaching basketball for Marshall University. And it was just a tremendous program. You know, and the reason I'm mentioning is because I just left it, and I'm still impressed with the character that he delivered to this audience. I mean, the people loved him, and I can see why. Love him, and I can see why. He's got a wonderfully warm personality, a great sense of humor. He had his assistant coach with him, who was a player. And as a player attended Duke University under Coach Mike Krzyzewski. His name, by the way, his name is Chris Duhon. Some of you may remember because he played with the New York Knicks for a number of years after he left Duke. And he and Dan D'Antoni have been friends for a number of years. And when Dan secured the position as head basketball coach at Marshall University last year, he called Chris to see if Chris would join him and help him. And so they are together, and both of them came for the program today, and just the nicest people. Very, very interested in improving the graduation rate of basketball players, of working very hard to make sure that the basketball players that are recruited at Marshall University are not kept separate from the mainstream of the university, but interact with other students so that there's a tremendous rapport already taking shape between the student body and the basketball team, and put a major emphasis on the issue of character, recognizing that while it is possible that there may be a player or two in that program that may have a shot at the NBA, the fact of the matter is most of these kids are not going to be NBA caliber. So therefore, what they get out of playing basketball at Marshall University in terms of building citizenship and goodwill and social skills and genuine affection for the region and for the institution that they attend and for the game they play is a priority with these two gentlemen. And it was a great program. It really was. I was very impressed. I don't have any direct contact with Marshall University, but just as a result of having attended this program today, I intend to, excuse me, to keep my eye on Marshall University this year, because I feel like I do have a bit of a connection with the team, because I feel I have been moved, genuinely moved, by the quality of this particular program today. But anyway, that was what I came from when we went on the air. I just got back about 3 minutes before we went on the air, and I kind of wanted to share that with you because it's in my mind, and I just wanted to let you know where we are and what we're doing. Before we pick up on yesterday's program and continue a little bit, excuse me a moment, I'd like to spend a few minutes at least reviewing or summarizing a bit about yesterday's program in order to set the stage for what we're doing today. You'll remember that when we finished our program yesterday at 3 p.m. here in the East, we were into a document that was written in Great Britain, in England, in 1647. And the document, very specifically, is entitled The Agreement of the People. And it was a document written by the very famous group called the Levelers, and it was presented to the Council of the Army in England. And that requires a little bit of historical background. Why would this particular agreement be presented to the Council of the Army? Well, in 1647, England was in the midst of a civil war. And without going into a lot of details about what constitutes the Civil War itself, let me just make a couple of general comments about it, and I think it will put this background, this document, into some perspective. The Civil War broke out early in the 17th century, in the 1600s, in Great Britain, and principally it was a civil war aimed at the reign first of James I and second Charles I. And as we mentioned yesterday, in 1647, by 1647, the Civil War, the forces of Parliament under the leadership of Oliver Cromwell had successfully captured King Charles I and held him as prisoner. And so in the 1640s, England ceased to have a monarch, ceased to have a king, and was under the rule of a military protectorate under the leadership of Oliver Cromwell. Excuse me. And that situation existed in England until 1660. And in 1660, the crown was restored in the person of Charles II, Charles's son, obviously. And the background to this, I think, is very, very interesting. Because the Civil War and the story behind the Civil War had a number of facets to it, as any complicated historical event does. Nothing is simple. Nothing happens for only one reason, especially something as big as a war. And so what you find is that this Civil War in England had social, economic, and political ramifications to it. Politically, forces of the king, the landed aristocracy that had traditionally controlled England since the Middle Ages, and the degree to which this landed aristocracy supported the king and the right of the king to rule absolutely. In fact, the king claimed that he ruled by divine right, which meant, as the term indicates, that the king believed and argued and so told his people that the king's power to rule came directly from God, that the king, in effect, was God's agent, appointed by God to rule England. Therefore, because that power came from God, it was absolute. And consequently, because of the abuses that James I and then Charles I, at least the perception was that these were abuses of the royal power, an opposition internal dissent began to build, and an opposition force committed to the overthrow of the crown came into being. And its principal source of loyalty, if you will, was to Parliament, to the legislative branch of government. So in political terms, what this Civil War became was a struggle between the absolute power of the monarchy and the demand for power by the legislative branch, Parliament. But here's the social part. Whereas the old landed aristocracy provided the principal support for the king, the emerging middle classes, the business community, as you will, the growing commercial element in London and many of the other seaports in England, was supporting Parliament. Obviously, what this indicated was that the struggle was much more than a political struggle between two branches of government. In effect, it was a struggle between two totally different classes of people. The landed aristocracy representing Great Britain's past, and the commercial, vibrant, middle-class business community that seemed to represent or to reflect England's commercial future. And in the course of this Civil War in the 1640s, the opposition forces were able to capture the king. Charles I was a prisoner, if you will, of the army. Theoretically, the army was in control. Consequently, the council of the army were the ones that received this petition, this agreement from the people, so to speak. And in 1649, the opposition party put the king on trial, found him guilty, and beheaded Charles I. And from that point on, Oliver Cromwell ruled as Lord Protector from the late 1640s all the way up until 1660. And this is where a complicated story becomes even more so. Because you would think that the story would end there. But it doesn't, because in 1660, both sides, those supporting Parliament and those landed nobles who continued to support the monarchy, were able to put aside their differences and come together to support the restoration of the crown in the person of Charles II. So what we have to ask ourselves is, what is it that would unite these two forces that had been so at odds with each other that literally one side beheaded the head of the other side? And the answer is that while the Civil War was raging, there was a growing dissident movement within England of people who up to this point in time had never participated actively in England's government at all. These were people who couldn't vote. These were people that had no rights. These were people that owned no land. In other words, there was a real danger in England under the leadership of Cromwell that England was in store for a real, genuine civil war. That the masses were getting anxious. The masses were getting antsy, as it were. And increasingly, the group that began to speak for this most radical element in the whole controversy, the people, were the so-called levelers. And the reason they were called levelers is because they advocated the end of inequality in society and advocated a goal of creating a nation in England in which everybody was really equal and everybody was treated equally. And one of the things they talked about doing was taking property from the wealthy and redistributing it among the poor. To business and to the upper classes, to the wealthy, this is the most dangerous, heretical thing that could possibly happen. It literally is an overthrow of freedom. And instead, government falls under the total control of the majority. The thinking is it's pure democracy. From the perspective of business, the propertied, those with wealth, and those with power, it's revolution. In effect, it's the same kind of revolution that Karl Marx was to predict 2 centuries later would eventually overthrow industrial capitalism in the Western world and lead to the ideal state of communism where everybody was the same. So in a sense, what we're saying is that the levelers of the 17th century in England constituted an early version of the socialist movement in the 19th century. And it's to stifle, to totally suppress this movement and to keep the masses under control that the two sides are able to put aside their differences and come together to restore the monarchy, realizing that England always had a king. The people's loyalty to the nation had always been determined by their loyalty to the person of the king. And absent that figurehead, absent that crown, that royal figure, politics and social order in England was moving toward anarchy, absolute chaos. And so both sides realized that the threat posed by the levelers and the ability of the levelers to appeal to the masses posed a threat to the powerful in England that was greater than the threat posed within the power structure between these two groups, the middle-class business community on the one hand and the landed aristocracy on the other. What I would like to leave this story with is just to make a point that I think there are 2 significant things to pay attention to that come out of this English Civil War for our purposes. The first one, which I think is significant, is that we learn an awful lot about the structure of power and the degree to which political power and economic power are linked. The extent to which the business community, the emergent commercial classes in the cities of England, become very, very supportive of the crown, become very, very supportive of government, because government's pursuit of international wealth and power is directly built upon the accumulation of wealth within the country. The nation that becomes the most independent in terms of its ability to meet its own needs, to provide for its own resources, through its power, through the colonies it possesses, through the empire it is able to create and manage. The nation that controls the flow of wealth controls power within the world of competing nations, nation-states. So the power of government is contingent on the success of business, the business community. In this case, the commercial interests. This is well before industrialism, well before manufacturing takes off in the early and mid-19th century. So what we're talking about here are the beginning stages of capitalism. And the beginning stages are the commercial stages. The term that usually is used to define this particular stage of capitalism is mercantilism. And obviously in the word itself, mercantilism, we see almost exactly the word merchant. So it suggests the beginning of a commercial world based on buying and selling and trading with the purposes of accumulating profit and wealth. This is the future, not only in England, but in every Western nation. And so it's very obvious that while there is a natural interconnection and relationship between government and business, what makes that relationship less than perfect for business is the power of the traditional old landed aristocracy, the traditional ruling elements of English politics and English society. Because those that traditionally wielded power in an England controlled by an absolute king do not willingly surrender that power and that influence to these up-and-coming newcomers, these bankers and investors and insurance people and shippers and merchants. Consequently, the only way that they are able to get power over government, or at least gain the influence with government that they believe they need, is to move up to the point that they replace the traditional landed aristocracy. Consequently, politically, their champion becomes Parliament. By the time you get into the I'd say the first third of the 17th century in England, it becomes very obvious that most of the members elected to Parliament, representing the cities and the commercial portions of English society, are middle-class people, are business people. So what effectively happens is that the new commercial middle classes control Parliament. So consequently, this quest for power between Parliament and the king is really a struggle for power between the traditional power structure in England and the up-and-coming newcomers, so-called, the business community. Excuse me. But the other thing that becomes very clear in this struggle is that the greater threat to both of these groups are the masses who must be managed, who must be governed. And what the levelers are doing is using the opportunity, the opening created by civil war, to engage the masses into political discourse and political discussion and political activity to a degree that they had never been involved in before. And this frightens all those who believe in the traditional power ought to go with the few rather than the many. So consequently, they are able to put aside their differences, come together, and restore the monarchy. Recreate the personage of the royal crown, the source of the kind of affection that traditionally in England has kept the people in line. I think it's a fantastically interesting story. As we know, this story doesn't end in 1660, because Charles II, when he comes into power, is obviously able to lure the support of both the middle-class commercial interests and the landed aristocracy, as both sides are competing with each other for the king's support. And over time, the king gets into trouble again, because it is felt in both sides that the king is overstepping his bounds and is not treating Parliament with the respect that Parliament deserves. When Charles II dies in the 1680s and is replaced by James II, the last of the Stuart kings, the situation really becomes explosive in England because James II is a Roman Catholic. And this is just about all that the forces, the middle-class forces in England, can stand. And in 1688, in what we very affectionately refer to as the Glorious Revolution, the forces of Parliament are able to expel James II, forced him to flee to France, where the Catholics belong, so to speak. And they invite William of Orange and Mary to England to accept the crown. But in the course of accepting the crown, they are forced to sign the Bill of Rights of 1689, which forever grants Parliament supremacy over the monarchy. And that's the point at which Parliament becomes supreme in British politics. It's a tremendous story. But it's one that really one needs to understand a little bit about in order to understand where the levelers come from and why the levelers pose the threat they do. It's 1 minute after the hour of 2 p.m. in the East. We're going to pause very, very briefly, just a couple of minutes, take a very short break. We'll be right back with our full hour of the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. This is Bill O'Brien, and after a short break, we'll be right back. Please stay with us.
Okay, let's go back to Dr. Bill O'Brien and the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Wake up, Dr. Bill.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid. Wake up, everybody, because, boy, that music is just wonderful. That is absolutely so soothing and so relaxing.
That was Héctor Villalobos.
Oh, it was wonderful. Thank you, Bob.
Sure,
it was just great. We are into our second hour here at the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It's 4 minutes after the hour, 4 minutes after the hour of 2 in the East. Our phone number, again, area code 304-574-8178. 304-574-8178. My email address, WAO'Brien, IEN, 906 @gmail.com. That's WAO'Brien, 906 @gmail.com. If you were just joining us, welcome. If you've been with us for the first half hour of our program, we thank you for staying with us. And let me just mention for those that are just joining us that in our first half hour, what we were looking at was the structure of the so-called British English Civil War of the 1640s and 50s. And what we were looking at is the elimination of the monarchy, the establishment of power, military power under Cromwell, and then the restoration of the crown under Charles II in 1660. And what I was getting at was there were two major reasons why I think this story is important for us in understanding the Constitution and the ramifications and implications of America's Constitution. One is that much of the rhetoric employed by the so-called patriots in America's war for independence in the 1760s and 1770s is rhetoric and literature taken directly from the English Civil War of a century earlier. Much of the anti-government anti-absolute government rhetoric that our founders use against what are termed abuses of power by Parliament and by the King is rhetoric taken directly from the anti-government rhetoric of the 1640s and 1650s in England. The most prominent example of that are the famous Cato letters, which are the letters written by Gordon and Trenchard in the British newspapers arguing against the absolute power of the king. And much of that rhetoric, much of that literature is reborn in America in the 1760s and 70s, but this time it's turned against England itself, against Parliament itself. That alone, it seems to me, makes the English Civil War important to us and significant. The other thing that makes the Civil War significant is that in order to justify the emergence and ultimately the power of Parliament and the move away from absolute government, it becomes necessary for a whole new group of philosophers and political theorists to come forward with the kind of philosophy and theoretical rhetoric born of the opposition to absolute government. And increasingly, people begin to look with favor upon those who argue for limited government, for the fact that government is limited, and it is limited principally to protecting the property of the propertied, i.e., the middle class's business. And the hero of this particular situation becomes John Locke. Because John Locke's essays on civil government, written to justify the Glorious Revolution of 1688, become the origins of the idea of the state of nature, the idea of natural rights or unalienable rights, and the definition of the legitimate role for government as to protecting man's natural rights. Positions which are very, very well known and become very, very well known in America during the 1760s and 70s, and obviously are the basis for the affinity between Jefferson's Declaration of Independence and the philosophy of John Locke. And as you know, we spent quite a bit of time looking at the material written by Gary Wills in his Inventing America to suggest that while there clearly is an affinity with the ideas and the thinking of John Locke, there's much more to Jefferson's Declaration than a paraphrasing of Locke's second treatise in civil government. That in effect there's an awful lot that comes out of the Scottish philosophy that belongs in the rhetoric and in the thinking behind the Declaration of Independence. And that's really, those are the issues that we've been wrestling with pretty much throughout a good portion of this past summer, actually, here at the Virtual Center. But my major purpose in recreating this idea of the story behind the Civil War in England is to create the kind of perspective, the kind of historical context that gives us an ability to understand in this world, in this capitalistic, free enterprise, individual freedom kind of world, what we mean when we say that something or somebody is radical. In other words, what does radical mean within the context of an emerging commercial, business, middle class, kind of life? And the answer to that is that while there's a struggle for power between two competing groups representing the few and the wealth and the education of the few, the one thing that both groups have in common is they are not Democrats. They do not advocate the kind of idea where everybody is equal and should be treated that way. And the one thing that both sides in the English Civil War are committed to is the need to closely control and manage the masses. Those without property, those without a stake in society, those without a vested interest or without any skin in the game, those without the kind of education, background, traditions, and interests which would make them quality participants in government. What they are talking about is the people who need to be managed, who need to be governed, who need to be kept under control, who need to be told what to do. And the reason the levelers are considered England's radicals is because the levelers are appealing to a group of people that few in the upper echelons of English society believe are worthy of being considered participants in politics at all. And so consequently, the levelers are considered to be radical. So it stands to reason then that the agreement of the people that they submit to Cromwell and to the Council of the Army in 1647 is written from a perspective which is designed to promote equality in England rather than to sustain the kind of inequality that has traditionally existed in England. Consequently, and I think when we started to look at this document yesterday in the beginning, or the so-called preamble to the document, we begin to say that what this agreement of the people is urging is fairness and equal treatment of everybody, which within that particular period in England means if equality and equal treatment for everybody is going to be the objective, then that means the elevation of a whole constituency within English society that has never been considered qualified to hold equal status. This is a threat to the powers that be in England, whether they be landed noble representatives or whether they be commercial interests. And so what we see in this document is an effort to eliminate the unfairness that exists in the way people are governed, in the way people are represented, in the way people are treated. Consequently, and quickly, I'll read it. We did this yesterday, so I won't spend a whole lot of time on this. But this agreement begins as follows. Having by our late labors and hazards made it appear to the world at how high a rate we value our just freedom, and God having so far owned our cause as to deliver the enemies thereof into our hands, in other words, they have the king, is their prisoner. And they are basically claiming that they were able to do that because that proves God's on their side. We are the forces of right. And it's that perspective on which this document is written. Therefore, we do now hold ourselves bound in mutual duty to each other to take the best care we can for the future, to avoid both the dangers of returning into a slavish condition and the chargeable remedy of another war. Our goal, our duty, is to stay bound to each other and to make sure we never allow ourselves to regress into the former position of inequality and slavishness under which we lived previously here in England as acknowledged unequals. 4, and it goes on with the word for as it cannot be imagined that so many of our countrymen would have opposed us in this quarrel if they had understood their own good. And this is, I think, very telling, because what this means is that there's been a lot of lies told about us. If people had really understood that we were really their best representatives, that what we were after is in their own best interests. In other words, if they knew what was best for them, they would support us rather than be opposed to us. So may we safely promise to ourselves that when our common rights and liberties shall be cleared, their endeavors will be disappointed that seek to make themselves our masters. Once we become successful, we will never again allow anybody to consider themselves masters over us. England will be a nation where nobody is master over anybody. To English tradition, that's radical. Since, therefore, our former oppressions and the scarce yet ended troubles have been occasioned either by want of frequent national meetings in council, or let me repeat. Since, therefore, our former oppressions and scarce yet troubles have been occasioned either by want of frequent meetings in council or by rendering those meetings ineffectual, we are fully agreed and resolved to provide that hereafter our representatives be neither left to an uncertainty for the time nor made useless to the ends for which they are intended. No more will Parliament, our representatives, be allowed to make independent decisions. From now on, we'll tell them what we want. And our representatives will really represent us. In other words, the masses will be in control. It will be, with elected representatives, it'll be a true democracy, or at least something very close to a true democracy. A perfect democracy would be one where all the people get together and make decisions by majority rule. You can't have that in a nation, in a country. But what we can do is have representative government making sure that the people who elect the representatives control them, instruct them, tell them exactly what to vote for and what to vote against. So government ceases to be a force over people. Government instead becomes a force representing the priorities and the best interests of the people. What these people stand for is a public interest that is not defined by government, but a public interest is defined by the people who elect representatives to the government. That's the preamble. That's radical. Then they go into specifics as to the specific changes, and we looked at a few of these yesterday. First one, that the people of England, being at this day very unequally distributed by counties, cities, and boroughs for the election of their deputies in Parliament, ought to be more indifferently proportioned according to the numbers of the inhabitants. No longer will certain sections and certain groups of people have a louder voice or more of a voice in government than everybody else. From now on, Government representation will be proportionally distributed according to numbers. Each representative, as closely as possible, will represent approximately the same number of people. Again, equality and fairness. Second, that to prevent the many inconveniences arising from the long continuances of the same persons in authority, this present Parliament will be dissolved upon the last day of September, which shall be in the year of our Lord 1648. In other words, when this power ends at the end of the session next year, in September of 1848, all the people that are in Parliament will be gone. We will institute new rules with new representative or parliamentary districts, if you will, and we will elect totally new people. No longer will we have a parliament where the same people get elected over and over and over again. And of course, it's important to keep in mind that if the people who elect the representative are going to tell the representative what to do, then the person who's elected, that is meaningless. The quality of the person is meaningless. All that matters is that the person elected do what the people who elect him tell him to do. Third, that the people do, of course, choose themselves a parliament once in 2 years. In other words, we will have frequent elections every 2 years upon the first Thursday in every second March. In other words, every other March on the first Thursday we will elect a new parliament, after the manner that shall be described before the end of this parliament, to begin serving in April the following at Westminster or such place as be appointed by the representatives, etc. And finally, that the power of this and all future representatives of this nation is inferior only to theirs who choose them. Parliament no longer is subject to the king. Parliament is supreme within English government, except that even more supreme are the people who elect them. It is the people who are sovereign. They elect the representatives. They tell the representatives what to do. But once they do that, there's no force within government that can interfere or prevent the representatives from the people, from carrying out the people's will. Parliament will have the powers to enact, alter, and repeal laws, to erect and abolish offices and courts, to appoint, remove, and call to account magistrates and officers of all degrees, to the making of war and peace, the treating with foreign nations, and generally, Parliament will have the power to do whatsoever is not expressly or impliedly reserved by the represented to themselves. In other words, Parliament will have the power to do everything except what the people expressly refuse to give them power to do. The rights that the people keep for themselves. And then they define these, and there are 5. The first right, that matters of religion and the ways of God's worship are not at all entrusted by us to any human power. The right to religious freedom. Because therein we cannot remit or exceed a title of what our consciences dictate to be the mind of God. What they are saying is the only way we can know the mind of God is through our hearts. If we are going to follow the will of God, we have to listen to what God tells us internally. That means we cannot entrust control over religion to anybody without willful sin. And then they go on to say in that first item, nevertheless, the public way of instructing the nation so it be not compulsive is referred to their discretion. Parliament will have control over the instruction of the people, but Parliament will not have the power to tell people how to worship or what they must believe. Second, that the matter of impressing and constraining any of us to serve in the wars is against our freedom. No longer will we be required to fight and die in wars started by somebody else. Therefore, we do not allow it in our representatives. Rather, they can never want numbers of men apt enough to engage in any just cause. If they need soldiers, let them hire them. They've got the money. They've got the power to tax. Let them buy the armies they need. But they're no longer going to be able to come and enforce us, impress us into military service. Third, that after the dissolution of this present Parliament, no person be at any time questioned for anything said or done in references to the late public differences. In other words, after this Parliament ends, there'll be no retribution for what anybody did in the current differences that exist. In other words, the Civil War. No payback. Government's not going to come back and arrest people for what they said or what they did during this controversy. So in other words, in number 3, what they are basically asserting here as the right is the right to complete amnesty. Because technically speaking, they realize what they're doing is a violation of the law. And so what they need to make sure of is when government begins, the government that they create, it will not use the law against the people for what they did to create it. Fourth, that in all laws made or to be made, every person may be bound alike, and that no tenure, estate, charter, degree, birth, or place do confer any exemption from the ordinary course of legal proceedings whereunto others are subjected. Everybody will be equal before the law. Everybody. Nobody, because of their tenure or the amount of property they have or the degrees they hold or the birth or who they are, in other words, the family to whom they were birthed or the place they were born, none of these things will ever again be justified for people being treated differently or unequally. And then the last one, that as the laws ought to be equal, so they must also be good, and not evidently destructive to the safety and well-being of the people. Excuse me, I wasn't fast enough on the pause button that time. Number 5 basically suggests that the priorities of the people, the public interest, will always be the priority of government and the law. All the laws passed will be designed and aimed at promoting the best interests and the well-being of the people. And then finally, this is the conclusion of the Levelers' Agreement of the people. These things we declare to be our native rights, our natural rights, our unalienable rights. When you say that these rights are native, that means they don't come from government. They come from something much superior to government, which is Almighty God. And therefore, are agreed and resolved to maintain them with our utmost possibilities against all opposition whatsoever, being compelled thereunto, not only by the examples of our ancestors, whose blood was often spent in vain for the recovery of their freedoms, suffering themselves through fraudulent accommodations to be still deluded of the fruit of their victories, but also by our own woeful experience, who, having long expected and dearly earned the establishment of these certain rules of government, are yet made to depend for the settlement of our peace and freedom upon him that intended our bondage and brought a cruel war upon us. No longer will the people have to depend for their own safety and their own protection and their own well-being on peoples whose interests not only are totally different from the interests of the people, but in many cases are antagonistic and alien to the best interests of the people. This agreement is considered to be radical. The levelers are considered to be radical. I think the purpose here is to use this situation from history in order to make clear what radicalism is and why radicalism is radical. And that really is the purpose. I would suggest to you, excuse me, that if you think back to Madison's Federalist number 10, when he talks about the majority faction, and when Madison talks about constructing a form of government, a structure of government, that will make it impossible for the majority faction to ever gain power, this is what he's talking about. This is what he anticipates will happen in America if the majority are ever allowed to gain power. To Madison, the reasons why the Articles of Confederation had to be abandoned and replaced with something stronger, Constitution of the United States, is because the way the Articles of Confederation were constructed, with power on the state level and the political power within the states concentrated in the legislative branch of government, that combination created the potential for what the levelers are advocating here. Specifically, the ability of the majority of the people to get together and use the ballot box to elect representatives who must take their marching orders from the people who elect them. To Madison, in his Vices of the American Political System, the reason the Articles of Confederation had to be altered, had to be revised, Madison believed had to be totally abandoned, is because the negatives that the nation was experiencing under the Articles were the beginning signs, signals of majority rule democracy in America. Madison believed and said many times that the structure of government under the Articles, where power was in the states and power within the states was in the legislatures, made it too easy for those he called demagogues, local political leaders, prominent, wealthy, powerful people whose principal interest was not the public interest, but their own self-interest. To fool the people, to sell them a bill of goods, and to organize the kind of popular support that will get them elected to prominent positions in government. And the way the articles were constructed, once in office, they became powerful, these demagogues. And the consequence was that the best interests of the people weren't being served. The self-interest of the demagogues themselves were being served. So that's where Madison's fear of the majority faction comes from, is this document. And that's why I believe that it's a document that we should be somewhat familiar with. We have a minute or two more than 20 minutes left in our program today. And this is something that we probably won't have time to finish. But I'd like to really introduce it if I could, unless, if you have an issue or something you would like to ask or ask for repeated or explained or anything else, then I invite you to give us a call at 304-574-8178. Again, 304-574-8178. Because right now we're transitioning from one topic to another. So this is a good time. If not hearing anything, I'm assuming that we can move from one issue to another. But as I think those of you who follow the Virtual Center on any regular basis know, traditionally, I don't shift from one subject to the other that easily. And what I mean is there's usually a transition from topic to topic that makes some sense. There's a connection. I'd like to make that connection right now. The one thing that we've been talking about in our recent programs, and I remind you again that our theme yesterday was pretty much the fear of internal dissent and discord in America that seemed to be a factor at the Constitutional Convention and seemed to be a factor in causing people to attend the Constitutional Convention and thereby express their support for the need to revise the Articles of Confederation. Some of them, we know, were not ready to abandon the Articles of Confederation altogether. Many of the people who came to the Constitutional Convention were chosen as representatives of their states to participate in the revision of the Articles, not the total scrapping of them. So consequently, when the doors close and Edmund Randolph begins to chair the Constitutional Convention and makes the plea for the total abandonment of the Articles of Confederation and the consideration instead of a whole new form of government, which is the Virginia Plan, drafted by James Madison, a number of the delegates at that point walk out. Many of them are opposed. Some of them are just afraid to do something that they weren't delegated to do when they were selected to go to Philadelphia. But the one thing that I think we've done both yesterday and in our last program last week is to recognize that a major factor at the Constitutional Convention was fear of internal discord, dissent, civil war, turbulence, whatever you want to call it. A number of them spoke to it. And the other factor that we pointed out yesterday is a number of the people who were advocating the strong government reflected in the new Constitution did everything they could do to exaggerate events like Shays' Rebellion in order to so frighten the people that they would be much more inclined to go along with the abandonment of the Articles and support for the new structure of government advocated by the Federalists. And that's really the lead into the ratification struggle that we know. And one of the things we also know, and for this we have probably as much to thank James Madison for as anybody, because of that piece that he wrote in 1829, the piece that we looked at so carefully in recent weeks. Even Madison realized that the preservation of a republican form of government, popular government as we know it, was at best limited. Madison projected that it might last 100 years, but not much more than that, because by that time, the internal pressures, the internal dissent to be created by a growing population of non-property owning people, principally living in cities, was going to put so much pressure on government that it was very likely that government would have to resort to something much stronger than the Constitution in order to suppress it and in order to control it. Madison said in that letter that in the past, in past societies, past republics, these very same circumstances had produced strong military dictatorships, monarchies, despotic governments, or something quite worse, which is chaos, anarchy. Consequently, what Madison was making the case for in that particular piece of writing was the willingness and the ability of government to continually adapt and adjust to changing circumstances. The longer government was able to do that, and the more successfully government was able to do that, the longer the republic would last. This is the point that we made last week when we completed coverage of that particular piece by James Madison on his defense of the extending of the suffrage, the right to vote, to householders and the heads of families, people without property. Madison believed that by admitting masses of people in society who didn't own property and therefore didn't have a stake into the governing of society, the participation in the governance of society, that you were in effect giving them a stake or a vested interest in good government. It may not be a material stake like property, but in a sense what Madison was suggesting is that the right to vote was kind of a psychological stake or vested interest in society. People are not likely to turn against governments that they believe they, at least in part, control. And so Madison's whole case here is for government's ability and willingness to adapt, to constantly meet changing situations with the kind of flexibility that would enable the republic to last even longer, recognizing that if government wasn't able to adapt, the republic's lifespan would turn out to be a lot less. And the point that I've tried to make, and this is the point I want to make again, because this is the transition from where we've been to where I think we need to go. Is that what we see here is that despite Antonin Scalia, Robert Bork, the Tea Party, and other conservatives in America who would argue that the only way to determine the constitutionality of laws, of legislation, is to measure these particular laws against the intent of the founders, the original intent of the founders. In other words, what Antonin Scalia, Robert Bork, the Tea Party, and other right-wing interests in this country advocate is an approach to constitutionalism, an approach to the Constitution of the United States, based on the assumption that the system is not flexible, that the system is not to be adaptable, that the system must be fixed and must be anchored rigidly to the original intent of the founders. Well, we just looked at a founder, James Madison. And he's not just any founder. He's the founder's founder. He's the one that created the Constitution, for heaven's sake. And we heard him make an appeal for flexibility and adaptability, for progressive change, for the ability of government to meet change in ways that allow government to continually redefine the public interest and redefine the avenues for promoting that public interest, recognizing that as long as people believe that government has their priority or their best interests at heart, they will continue to support it. The republic will remain whole as long as people believe that they matter, and that their families matter, and their futures matter, and their kids matter, and their standard of living matters. Consequently, government must continually adapt, change, upgrade its priorities in order to remain out in front of change, in order to make sure that the people remain behind it. That means that the founders did not intend a structure of government that was fixed and inflexible, despite the efforts of Scalia, Robert Bork, the Tea Party, and others to argue just the opposite. Rather, the founders believed that the life of the Republic was directly dependent on the ability to which it remained flexible and adaptable. Where is the transition here? Where do I think we need to go? And I'm kind of setting up tomorrow's program here. We have about 7 minutes left in our program today. On the 3rd of September, which was last Wednesday, a week ago, less than a week ago, there was an article written in the New York Times by Linda Greenhouse. Linda Greenhouse is the New York Times correspondent that covers the Supreme Court. And in this article, Linda Greenhouse addressed the very issues that we just talked about with James Madison. At the end of her article, she points out that the Supreme Court 2 months ago, in a decision entitled National Labor Relations Board versus Noel Canning, the Supreme Court lived out the traditional struggle between the forces of originalism and the forces of progressivism. In a decision rendered by the Supreme Court and ultimately controlled by Justice Stephen Breyer in a direct confrontation over Antonin Scalia. Linda Greenhouse points out in her article that Justice Scalia was so furious in his objection to what Justice Breyer was arguing in this case that he even used the term national catastrophe to describe the direction that the Supreme Court was going in this case. We don't have time to get into the details of the case right now. We only have about 3 minutes to go. But let me read you the basis of the conflict between Scalia and Justice Breyer. In his dissent, Justice Scalia argued in 49 pages, which is 8 pages longer than the decision itself, that there was no ground for the majority's deference to the unconstitutional recess appointments practices of the executive branch. Scalia said that the real tragedy of today's opinion was the damage done to our separation of powers jurisprudence. Linda Greenhouse argues that the real damage done in this decision was to the originalism to which Justice Scalia was tied. And then she closes the article by saying that it is not for nothing that Justice Breyer entitled his 2010 book, Making Our Democracy Work. This decision from just 2 months ago suggests that the controversy, the case for adaptability over rigidity is being played out right now in the day-to-day business of the Supreme Court of the United States. This is relevant stuff. This is important stuff. What I would like to do tomorrow here at the Virtual Center is look in some detail at the Canning decision of the Supreme Court, the Noel Canning decision, which revolves around the right of President Obama to make recess appointments. You will remember that the obstruction of Republicans in Congress reared itself some months ago by the Senate being almost on permanent recess, except that a couple of Republican conservative leaders stayed in Washington and came together in sham meetings every couple of days, not to conduct business, but to make sure that President Obama could not exercise his appointment powers during periods of recess on the part of the Senate. So in other words, even though the Senate was recessed, Obama was forbidden to make his appointments. And this case came to the Supreme Court. That's what the case is about. But the real issue is the debate over adaptability versus rigidity and originalism. With that, I think our day is at end. I'm seeing 58 minutes after the hour, so we've got less than 2 minutes before our next program begins here at the Head On Radio Network. This is Bill O'Brien for the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility, thanking you for being with us today and inviting you to come back tomorrow for another session. In the meantime, thank you. Please be safe. We want you to come back and join us.